In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to put together an awesome budget gaming PC in 2022, featuring this, the brand new RTX 3050. If you're looking for a system that can smash through the latest AAA titles at 1080p 60 frames per second, this is the build for you. Let's do this. As usual, I'm going to cover off each of our components, installing them as we go. Starting off with components like the RAM, motherboard and CPU. Moving on to the case, power supply and graphics card later, where we'll also be testing the performance of this build in over 10 of the most popular titles out right now. For the motherboard in this build, I've opted to go for MSI's B550M Pro VDH. An awesome budget board that gives us all the features we need at a price that frankly doesn't break the bank. To be honest with you, this board was actually a huge motivation behind the config that I've gone for. It may seem weird to build an AMD based system, which is what this motherboard of course provides, when Intel have got a new great i3 chip out. Simply put, this board for its $60 or $70 price tag, the latest pricing and availability can be found below, makes it a bit of a no-brainer. You simply can't build an Intel system around this price point, and the 3050 doesn't need an overly powerful CPU. This board does of course mean we're going AMD, and it's the main reason that I picked the Ryzen 3 3100. Now, against the backdrop of new flashy Intel launches, it might seem weird, but the board is so cheap and our $99 or $129 CPU, depending where you pick it up from, just makes the most sense and doesn't bottleneck the 3050. Yes, you'll get more performance from an i3, but you'll spend another $100 or so doing it. To install the processor into the motherboard, you need to locate your handy CPU socket. That's this thing right here. On your socket, you'll find a retention arm, which you can pull up nice and easily. And you'll also find a triangle indent in the top left corner just here. We're going to match that up with the corresponding triangle on our processor, our Ryzen 3 chip. And then all we need to do is slide the CPU in. We can do this nice and easily, just like so, and the chip will drop into place. Once you've done that, you can then push the retention arm down. That will secure your processor, and that's basically all there is to it. Once you've installed this, we can then move on to the RAM or the memory. A 16GB kit of Corsair's Vengeance RGB RT. Now this kit is pretty important for a build like this. 3600MHz is crucial when it comes to Ryzen processors, and 2 DIMMs rather than 1, even if the overall capacity is still the same, is also crucial. It gives us dual channel memory, something our CPU really benefits from. One thing about this kit that also helps is the lovely white accenting. You're going to line up the gold notch with the notch on your plastic DIMM slot, pull back the retention clips on either side, and then slide your DIMM into place. Repeat this step for as many DIMMs as you've got. For us, just the 2, 1 on the second and 1 on the 4th slots. The final thing to do before we finish up the motherboard for today is install the cooler. Now for a build like this, there's loads of options. The included stock AMD cooler does the job for a Ryzen 3 with its lower sub 100 watt TDP, but something like a Hyper 212 from Cooler Master will also work well. We've done a video actually comparing the difference between different coolers and how it impacts your frame rate. Go and check it out in the card section now. For us today though, we're going to drop a dab of thermal paste onto the processor, install the cooler, and that's basically it as far as the motherboard assembly goes. The next step of the build is to pick up the case. This right here is Deepcool's Macube 110, and it looks like a bit of a cube. It's got a nice tempered glass side panel on one side, dust filters on the top, and a decent I/O as well that gives you a couple of USB 3 ports, but to be honest with you, not a great deal much else. What I'm going to do is I'm going to spin it round and then pop off our magnetic side panel, which in theory just comes off a little something like that, nice and easy. And what that's going to do is reveal the innards of the case. Laying the case down flat is going to make the next stage of the build much easier, where we install the motherboard. For this stage of the build, you want to pick up the board itself and locate each of the standoff holes. So you'll be able to see here, there's 3 holes that go through the board at the top, there's a further 3 across the middle, and then there's 2 at the bottom, but these are at slightly different levels, they're not completely straight. these need to match up with the standoffs we've got in the case, and we can check this really easily. 3 at the top, all in one line, they're all correct. 3 across the middle, they look pretty good to me. And then you'll see there's an additional 1 just here and 1 here. They all look okay, but notice this hole here, that would be in the wrong place, because remember, the 2 standoffs at the bottom are not completely aligned. What we need to do before actually popping the motherboard in though is clip in the rear IO shield. That's this piece of metal right here. And what you need to do is position this in the back of the case. Your audio ports should be at the bottom towards these long PCI lanes, and the whole thing should just snap in nice and easily. You should hear a satisfying click sound, and then you can slide the board in. Pop the ports through the rear IO shield, position it over your standoffs and screw it into place. This step can be one of the more time consuming parts of the process, but when you get here you're more than halfway through. So keep going and don't lose that all important PC building motivation. We're then able to move on to the SSD and power supply, and we can wrap things up with our exciting GPU very shortly. Literally like another 90 seconds or so. Start the clock. So this right here is Seagate's Barracuda Q1. It is a SATA SSD, so it's cheap and it's cheerful. And I'm not necessarily saying it's the best storage solution ever, but it is going to work well for this build. It's going to be pretty snappy, a lot quicker than a hard drive. If you've got more money to spend, an M.2 SSD is the way to go. You can see here that you actually get included these 4 little posts. Now these screw into the bottom of your Gen 3 2.5-inch drive, and then when we flip the case around, you'll be able to see we've got some rubber grommets. What you do is you slide the SSD into those rubber grommets, and a friction mount keeps everything nicely in place. We're then able to add our power supply into the picture. This is Deepcool's DQ650. Now any 650 watt unit that you can buy is gonna work well. This 80 plus gold certified unit though is super efficient, and with a fully modular interface, you only plug in the cables you actually need to install. For us today, that's our motherboard, CPU, GPU, and a SATA power connection. Just make sure that you install the power supply with the fan facing down, otherwise you will starve it of air, and that's not good, well, for anybody really. What you then need to do is install all of your cables and wiring, and I'm gonna give you a quick swizz around which connections need going where. The first is a CPU power connector, which goes to the top left of the motherboard. This is 8 pins in our case and only goes in one way round. The 24-pin motherboard power connection goes to the right-hand side of the motherboard and is the largest power connector of the bunch, giving your motherboard, memory, and even CPU plenty of juice to get going. A SATA power cable goes up to our SSD, as does a SATA data cable, which comes included in your motherboard's box. The other end of the data cable plugs up to the motherboard itself. Finally, we've got a few front panel connections. HD audio goes to the bottom left of the motherboard and looks a little something like this, while USB 3 is the largest front panel connector. It is quite delicate, this one, and the pins are on the motherboard, so just be really careful. Finally, to wrap things up, we've got our power and reset buttons. These are our kind of front panel JFP1 connectors, as they're often referred to. These ones are the fiddliest of the bunch, but if you get them wrong, nothing bad will happen. You'll just have to go back and reseed them, as the power button might not work as intended. Or you might get your power and your reset button mixed up, which is not what you want. And once you're all wired up, you can add in the GPU. I've probably gone over the 90-second counter somewhere, but it kept you engaged, it kept you watching, and I've played the algorithm. Oh yes. Now this right here is the 3050 from MSI. It's their Gaming X Trio version. The 3050 is an awesome GPU for 1080p gaming, and it's a card that here in the UK you can actually buy for a reasonable price. Now I said this was the Gaming X Trio. It's not. It's the Gaming X, a double pair. I don't know, it's got 2 fans rather than 3, which helps with the MSRP and also of course with the cooling. The 3050 does not run hot and does not need 3 fans. Most notably as well, it's also a much better choice than this, the RX 6500 XT. You'll pay more for a 3050, but for good reason. Check out some of these gaming benchmark numbers that we tested out with this exact build. We'll be covering these in more detail in the benchmark section in just another 90 seconds though, so don't go anywhere for that. For now, we're going to install the GPU. It's going to slot into some of these slots on the rear of the case that are already handily removed for us. And what we need to do is make sure our PCI clip is pushed back or downwards. That will open up the way for the graphics card to slide into place nice and easily. Oh yes, and then it will clip in with a satisfying click sound. Use a screw or a pair of screws to fasten it into place, wire it up with an 8-pin PCIe power connection, and then the build actually is pretty much done. And I'm not being funny, I think it looks pretty good. What we're going to do next then is boot the system up to see just how well it performs, but first, how good it looks in a signature GeekaWhat montage. I'll see you in a sec, but first, roll that montage. Awesome stuff. Now that we've seen how good our budget 3050 build looks when it's all powered up, it's time to make sure the performance numbers stack up equally. On your screen now, first and foremost, is a summary of all the results we got. We test the same or similar games in all of our videos, so you can go back and compare our other content to this one to see just how different the results will be. We will be taking a deeper look though into some of these titles more closely, starting off with GTA 5. Here we tested at 1080p high settings and pulled in 160 frames per second on average, with 144 and 127 for the 90 and 99th percentiles. It was a similarly positive story in Battlefield 2042, where at 1080p high settings, we got 75 frames per second on average. Remember, of course, the fact we're using an RTX GPU opens up the world of possibility for DLSS and ray tracing too. So when we're covering off the settings used for some of our videos, make sure to keep an eye out for DLSS. A great example of this is the next title, COD Vanguard. It of course supports DLSS, and we tested with both it turned off and it turned on. Let's keep it off to begin with at 1080p high settings. This yielded 83 frames per second on average, with the frame rate never really dropping below 75 as far as the 99th percentile result goes. But what about DLSS turned on? Basically rendering the game out at 960p using AI to upscale, giving you the frame rate advantage of a lower res and the visual fidelity of 1080p. Here we got 128 frames per second, giving a staggering 45 FPS increase. That's more than 50% more frame rate just by enabling DLSS. And don't just take my word for it, take a look at the difference between DLSS off and DLSS on. Visually, can you see much? I can't. Forza Horizon 5 is next on the list. No DLSS here. Oh, sad times. But it does still perform well at 1080p high settings. How well? 98 frames per second wow. 90 and 99 percentiles were strong, and we tested in the game's inbuilt benchmarking mode. Because although it's a bit more boring, you can at least compare it to other titles if you like, or compare it to previous runs of Forza without too much headache. Next up is Halo Infinite. Here we tested out at 1080p high settings and managed to achieve 95 frames per second on average, just shy of 100 FPS at 1080p high on a 50 tier of GPU. It really is incredible to see. Moving on to Apex Legends next up, here we tested at 1080p high settings. Some of you will be going, James, why didn't you test it competitive? Well, at high we still pulled in 115 frames per second on a 3050. This is at high settings, my goodness me. That is one hell of a result, and also going to be great for if you've got a monitor that can of course refresh faster than 60 Hz. Moving on to Valorant next up, here the frame rate was absolutely ludicrous at 1080p high settings, giving us 441 frames per second on average. Oh my goodness. It's a similarly positive story in the last title today, a bit of Fortnite. Here we tested at 1080p competitive settings, aka everything tuned down to low, render distance set to far. 201 frames per second on average to be precise, over 200 FPS on a 3050. These results are bonkers. The 3050 is an awesome buy, and this 2-fan MSI cooler is a great bet if you're looking to build a 3050 system in 2022. With that though, that just about wraps it up for this one. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, we'll see you in the next GeekaWhat video.